Take her. She's yours. Consider the debt settled.
Something that felt, to Vivienne's horror, like recognition.
She was handed over like an object at auction, exchanged by her own husband for a gambling debt, presented to the most feared duke in England before the ink on his winnings was dry. Vivienne Ashbourne stood in the grand entrance hall of Blackmir Castle, her ivory gown still pristine from a wedding that now meant nothing, her chin lifted so the assembled lords would not see her tremble. The Duke of Blackmere descended the staircase with the unhurried authority of a man who owned every room he entered. He looked at her once, a slow, deliberate sweep from hem to face, and something shifted behind his cold, dark eyes. Something that should not have been there. Something dangerous. Something that felt, to Vivienne's horror, like recognition. Welcome to Duke Royal Tales, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. The arrangement had taken less than an hour to destroy 5 years of marriage. Lord Percival Ashbourne, charming, indebted, and catastrophically weak at cards, had lost everything in the private gaming room of Blackmir's London townhouse the previous evening. His estates, his carriage horses, and finally, with a smile that suggested he had not yet grasped the full weight of what he was doing, his wife, not her freedom, not her future, her presence. Percival had signed a document, drafted with unsettling speed by the Duke's solicitor, granting Sebastian Alaric Vane, the 6th Duke of Blackmere, full custodial claim over Lady Vivienne Ashbourne effective immediately, a feudal relic of a clause, dusted off from some forgotten corner of English law, legal, binding, and utterly humiliating. By morning, a carriage bearing the black and gold Blackmir crest had appeared at her door. Vivienne had not wept. She had packed one trunk, only what was hers before the marriage, and she had climbed into that carriage with her spine straight and her eyes dry. She was 26 years old. She was according to Percival's family and their physician, Barren, and she had just been traded away like a piece of unwanted furniture. What she did not know, as the carriage rolled north through the English countryside toward Yorkshire, was that the Duke of Blackmere had not requested her. He had demanded her. There was a difference, and it was one she would not understand until much later. Blackmir Castle was everything the rumors promised and nothing she had imagined. It rose from the moorland like something dreamed by a man who believed comfort was for lesser people. All dark stone, soaring battlements, and windows that caught the pewter Yorkshire sky and held it. Inside, it was warmer than she expected. Books lined the walls of every corridor. Fires burned in rooms that showed signs of actual use, not performance. It was a house where someone lived, not merely presided. The housekeeper, a composed woman named Mrs. Dray, led her to a suite of rooms in the east wing, 3 connected chambers with views over the moor, a fire already burning, and a vase of late autumn wildflowers on the writing table. His Grace thought you might prefer the view, Mrs. Dray said simply, and left her. Vivienne stood at the window for a long time, watching the heather bend in the wind, and tried to decide whether to be grateful or furious. She landed, as was her habit, on both. She did not see the Duke until dinner. The dining room was long and candlelit, set for 2 at one end of a table that could seat 30. He was already standing when she entered, which surprised her. Lords of his rank rarely bothered with the courtesy for women in compromised positions. He wore no formal coat, only a dark waistcoat over a white shirt with the collar open, and he looked less like an aristocrat and more like a man who had been working and had not entirely stopped. "Lady Ashbourne," he said. "Your Grace," she replied, and took the chair the footman offered without waiting for his invitation. His mouth curved, not quite a smile, something more measured than that. They ate in silence for several minutes. He did not try to fill it with pleasantries. She appreciated that more than she was prepared to admit. "I expect you have questions," he said, when the soup was cleared. "Several hundred," Vivienne replied. "I'll begin with the most pressing. What, precisely, do you intend to do with me?" Sebastian Alaric Vane set down his wineglass and looked at her directly, the same slow, deliberate look from the entrance hall, but without the distance. Up close, his eyes were not coal-dark, she noticed. They were a deep, complex gray, like the sky before a serious storm, and they were looking at her with something that made her breath catch without her permission. "Nothing," he said. "You are here as my guest, not my prisoner, not my property. You purchased me. I prevented someone else from doing so," he said. "There is a distinction." Vivienne stared at him. What does that mean? But he lifted his glass and looked away, and she understood that she would not receive that answer tonight. The following morning, she explored the castle on her own terms. The library stopped her cold. 3 stories of shelves, a rolling ladder on iron rails, natural light flooding in from a glass ceiling fitted above the gallery level. Philosophy, history, natural science, poetry, maps, actual maps, dozens of them, pinned and annotated in a cramped, precise hand. She was pulling a volume of Plato from the shelf when she heard footsteps behind her. "You read Greek?" His voice came from the doorway. She turned. He was dressed for writing, his dark hair pushed back from his forehead, and he was looking at the book in her hands with something approaching curiosity. "My father taught me," she said. He thought an educated daughter was more interesting than an accomplished one. The Duke said nothing for a moment. Then, he was right. He walked away before she could respond. But she stood in the library for a long time after holding the Plato, and realized her heart was beating slightly faster than usual. She told herself it was the cold. A week passed, then 2. The castle's rhythms became familiar. The early sound of horses in the stable yard, the smell of coffee that appeared in the library at precisely 9 each morning. She never asked for it. It simply arrived. The evenings where the Duke would sometimes join her after dinner, and sometimes not. And when he did, they would sit in the same room and read and speak very little. And she would find, when she finally went to bed, that the hours had passed with unexpected ease. He was not what she had expected. Not cruel, not cold. Cold was the wrong word for a man who remembered that she had mentioned once, in passing, that she disliked the smell of lily arrangements, and who had quietly removed every lily from the castle by the following morning. Not distant either. He was simply contained. He kept himself in a careful perimeter, like a fire burning steadily behind glass. Warm, visible, and deliberately untouched. She began to wonder what had built the glass. The answer came from an unexpected source. On a rain-sodden Tuesday, Mrs. Dray found Vivienne in the kitchen garden cutting the last of the autumn herbs, and joined her with 2 cups of tea and the particular manner of a woman who has something to say and has decided this is the moment. "He was engaged once," Mrs. Dray said, watching the rain on the kitchen window. 7 years ago. The lady withdrew 3 days before the wedding. Her family had received a better offer. A foreign title, more money. His Grace was told by letter. Vivienne's hand stilled on the rosemary. "He has not permitted himself to be close to anyone since," Mrs. Dray continued. "Not truly. He runs his estates. He sits in Parliament. He manages things with great competence and no warmth. We, the household, we have watched him. For 7 years. She looked at Vivienne. "He has not watched anyone the way he watches you." Vivienne did not know what to say to that. So she said nothing, and drank her tea, and tried not to think about the way the Duke's eyes moved to her whenever she entered a room. Always, always, as though he had known she was coming before she arrived. The first real fracture in the careful peace between them came 3 weeks after her arrival, in the form of a visitor. Lord Clement Fairvale arrived at Blackmir uninvited on a Friday afternoon, young, handsome in a studied way, and utterly transparent in his intentions. He was a neighbor, he explained at dinner, and an admirer of the castle's architecture. He stayed for 2 nights because the Duke, with minimal grace, could not refuse a peer's hospitality request without cause. Fairvale attached himself to Vivienne with the confidence of a man who believed himself irresistible. He complimented her intelligence during the first evening. He found reasons to touch her hand during the second. He made a joke at dinner, low enough that only she could hear, about a woman in her situation needing a protector who was younger and more willing. She handled it with perfect composure. She always did. What she did not handle was what she saw when she looked up from Fairvale's whispered comment. The Duke was watching from across the table. His expression had not changed, but his hand, resting on the table beside his wineglass, had closed into a slow, deliberate fist, and his eyes, meeting hers for exactly 1 second, said everything his face refused to. Fairvale left the following morning 2 hours earlier than planned. No one explained why. Mrs. Dray simply reported at breakfast that his lordship had pressing business in London and had sent his regrets. The Duke ate his eggs with complete composure. Vivienne said nothing. But later, walking the moor path behind the east wing, she found the Duke standing at the edge of the ridge where the land dropped away toward the valley below. He was not moving. He was looking at the horizon with the expression of a man containing something large. "What did you say to him?" she asked. A pause. Nothing he needed to hear twice. "I am capable of managing unwanted attention myself. I know you are." He turned, and the directness of his gaze was, as it always was, slightly too much, like standing too close to that fire behind the glass. "I was not doing it for your sake." Something in her chest turned over. "Then whose sake?" He held her eyes for a long moment, and then he walked back toward the castle without answering, and she stood on the ridge in the cold wind, with her heart doing something she had not given it permission to do. The letter came on a Thursday. It bore Percival's seal, sloppy, tilted, slightly wine-stained, and it was addressed to the Duke, not to her. She knew of its existence only because Sebastian, unusually, brought it to the library himself rather than having it delivered through his secretary. He placed it on the table beside her tea. He sat down. He was quiet for a moment. "Your husband is petitioning for your return," he said finally. "He claims the debt was invalid, made under duress, he says." Vivienne set down her book. "Is it valid?" "Legally, yes. The document is sound." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "But it is irrelevant. You are not in debt. You will not be returned like one. He is still my husband." "He was your husband," Sebastian said quietly. "My solicitors have been pursuing a dissolution of your marriage on grounds of abandonment since the week you arrived. With your consent, which I should have asked for at the outset and did not, the proceedings can be concluded within 2 months. Vivienne stared at him. "You have been doing this for weeks without telling me?" "Yes." He met her eyes without flinching. "I should have told you immediately. I did not. That was wrong." The apology landed with unexpected weight, clean, undecorated, completely sincere. Vivienne looked at him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "Yes, you have my consent." Something shifted in his expression, barely visible, but she caught it. Relief. November deepened. The moors went silver with frost. Their evenings in the library became longer, later, moving from reading in comfortable silence into conversation that ranged across philosophy, politics, the management of his northern estates, her own opinions on education reform, which she held with considerable force and which he listened to with the focused attention of a man genuinely revising his position. He asked, one evening, about the barrenness. Not cruelly, not even invasively. He asked the way a man asks about a wound he has noticed and wants to understand. "The physician was Percival's family physician," Vivienne said, keeping her voice steady. "He declared me barren after 1 year of marriage. I was never given a second opinion. Percival used it as the justification for everything that came after. The coldness, the debts he blamed on disappointment, eventually the gambling." "You believe the diagnosis was wrong," Sebastian said. "I believe it was convenient," she said. "For everyone except me." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "My physician in London is the finest in England. If you wish a second opinion, it can be arranged, with complete discretion." She looked at him across the low lamplight. "Why does it matter to you?" "Because the truth matters," he said simply. "And because someone should have offered you this years ago." She did not cry. She came very close, but she did not. What she did not know was that across the corridor, in the Duke's private study, Sebastian sat for a long time after she had gone to bed. He had known about Vivienne Ashbourne before the card game. That was the truth he had not told her, the one that lived like a splinter in his conscience. He had seen her once 2 years prior at a London musical evening, standing near the back of the room while her husband laughed loudly with other men and ignored her completely. She had been listening to the music with an expression of such concentrated, private joy that Sebastian had found himself unable to look away. He had not spoken to her then. She was another man's wife. But when Percival Ashbourne had appeared in his gaming room with his debts and his desperate smile, and Sebastian's solicitor had mentioned the clause, the old, feudal, almost never invoked clause, Sebastian had not hesitated. He had told himself it was principled, that he was removing her from a bad situation, that any decent man would have done the same. He was beginning to understand that was only part of the truth. The rest of the truth was sitting in his library every evening, reading Greek, drinking coffee he had arranged to arrive at exactly the right time, and looking at him occasionally with those clear, direct eyes that made him feel, for the first time in 7 years, like the glass might not need to stay in place forever. That was the most frightening thing he had encountered in a very long time. The dissolution proceedings moved quickly. 2 months, his solicitors had said, and they delivered. By mid-January, the marriage between Vivienne and Percival Ashbourne was legally concluded on grounds of abandonment and conduct unbecoming. Percival, characteristically, did not contest it. He had already moved on to his next disaster. The morning the papers were confirmed, Sebastian brought them to her himself. They stood in the entrance hall, the same hall where this had begun, and he handed her the document without ceremony. She read it through twice. Then she looked up. "What happens now?" she asked. "To me, here." Sebastian was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her with that particular contained intensity, and she could see, for once, that it was costing him something to keep it contained. "That depends," he said carefully, "on what you want. That is not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." A long pause. The fire cracked in the grate. Outside, the January wind moved over the moor. "I would like you to stay," he said quietly. "Not as a guest, not under any obligation. I would like you to stay because this house has been a different place since you arrived. And I have been a different person. And I am aware that both of those statements are more than I planned to say." Vivienne looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You planned that speech." His mouth curved, and this time, finally, it was a real smile, unguarded and slightly undone, and it transformed his entire face. "Every word," he admitted. She laughed, quietly, genuinely, and he watched her laugh with an expression that she would think about for a very long time afterward. "I'll stay," she said, "for now." It was not everything, but it was a beginning. And neither of them, standing in that entrance hall in the cold January light, was under any illusion that a beginning was a small thing. February arrived with a particular cruelty. Clear skies that looked like spring and temperatures that lied about it entirely. Vivienne walked the moor every morning now, and on most mornings Sebastian joined her, not always, but often enough that she had begun to notice the days when he did not, the way you notice when a familiar sound is absent from a room. They talked about everything on those walks, and rarely talked about the most important thing. She had begun to love him. She was not ready to say it, not to him, not even to herself in so many words. But it was there, present and undeniable as the frost underfoot, growing steadily in the space that his patience and his honesty and his quietly fierce protectiveness had cleared out of the place in her chest where Percival's indifference had lived for 5 years. She watched him manage his tenants with care and without condescension. She watched him sit for 3 hours with the steward going through drainage plans for the lower farms because it mattered to the people who worked those farms, not because it interested him. She watched him hold his composure perfectly in every public situation and come home and occasionally, when he thought she could not see, drop it completely, pressing one hand flat against the library window and staring at the moor with an expression that was simply, quietly tired. He was a man who had been carrying things alone for a very long time. She understood that more thoroughly than she wished to. The trouble came from London, as trouble reliably did. His Grace the Duke of Blackmere reported the society column of a London newspaper that arrived 3 days late and was read in the kitchen before it reached the library, was understood to be harboring the disgraced former Lady Ashbourne at his Yorkshire estate. Readers were invited to form their own conclusions. Within a week, 2 letters arrived from the Duke's family, one from his aunt, Lady Meredith Vane, and one from his older cousin, Lord Caldwell, who was apparently considering putting himself forward for political office and found the current arrangement somewhat unhelpful to his campaign. Sebastian read both letters at breakfast. His face said nothing. His coffee went cold. "You should send me to London," Vivienne said, watching him. I can find somewhere to stay. It would quiet the talk." "No," he said, without looking up from the letter. "It is the practical solution. It is also not going to happen." He set the letter down. "I am not in the habit of making decisions based on my cousin's electoral ambitions, Sebastian." She said his name, and he looked up. "People will assume the worst regardless. And you have a reputation and a seat in Parliament and—" "Vivienne." His voice was quiet but absolute. "The answer is no." A long silence. Something warm and complicated moved through her chest. "Your family will be angry," she said. "They will manage," he said, and picked up his coffee. Lady Meredith Vane did not manage. She arrived in person. She was 60, immaculately dressed, and formidable in the particular way of women who have spent decades being underestimated. She took tea with Vivienne in the East Wing sitting room, while Sebastian was out on the estate, and she assessed Vivienne over the rim of her cup with eyes that missed nothing. "You are not what I expected," she said finally. "What did you expect? Someone more obviously mercenary." Lady Meredith set her cup down. "The sort of woman who seeks out men of power in compromised situations. My nephew is wealthy and influential and, though I say it with all familial bias, genuinely exceptional. Women have tried to exploit that before." "I did not seek him out," Vivienne said evenly. "I was delivered to him against my will. I have been trying for 3 months to determine what I owe him and what I am." "And what have you determined?" Vivienne considered. "That I am not what his family will want for him, and that I am likely very bad for his reputation, and that I cannot seem to make myself care about either of those things as much as I should." Lady Meredith looked at her for a long moment. Then, to Vivienne's complete surprise, something softened in the older woman's face. "He has not smiled properly in 7 years," she said quietly. "Not once, until my maid wrote to me in January saying he had laughed at dinner." She rose, smoothing her skirts. "I came here to disapprove of you," she said. "I find I cannot manage it. I shall write to Caldwell and tell him to sort out his own campaign." She left the following morning without speaking privately with Sebastian. But she embraced Vivienne at the door, briefly, without fuss. And Vivienne stood in the entrance hall afterward and felt, for the first time in months, that she might actually belong somewhere. The physician from London came the following week. He was discreet, professional, and thorough. He spent 45 minutes in the East Wing examining room. He emerged and spoke with Vivienne privately for another 20 minutes. And then, because she asked him to, he spoke with Sebastian as well. Sebastian found her afterward in the library, standing with her back to the door, looking out at the frost-whitened garden. "Vivienne." She turned. Her eyes were bright, not with grief, she realized as he moved toward her, but with something she had not felt in a very long time, something disorienting and large. "He said there is no physiological reason," she said. "He said the previous diagnosis was, he said it was unsound, that with time," she stopped, draw a breath. "That there is every reason to believe," she stopped again because Sebastian had crossed the room and taken her face in his hands, and he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, open, unguarded, fierce with something that was not contained at all. "I know," he said quietly. "He told me. Sebastian, I need to tell you something," he said. "Something I have been—" He paused. For a man who was always in control of his words, he seemed, for once, to be searching. "I need to tell you why I was in that gaming room. Why did I take that debt?" She waited. "I had seen you," he said, "before, 2 years ago, at a musical evening in London. You were listening to the violin sonata, and you You looked like someone who had found the one true thing in a room full of pretending. And I could not speak to you because you were someone else's wife. So I watched, and I left, and I told myself I had forgotten. He had not forgotten. She could see that plainly. When Percival appeared at my table, he continued, my solicitor mentioned the clause. I should have found another way to help you, a cleaner way, a less, I know how it looks, I know what it is, I arranged it, and you deserve to know that from the beginning. The admission landed in the space between them. Vivienne looked at him, at the controlled, careful man who had built such careful walls and was, right now, dismantling them piece by piece with his own hands. It is a great deal to take in, she said, after a moment. Yes, he agreed. You manipulated the situation. Yes. And you have spent 4 months being genuinely, consistently decent about it. It seemed the minimum required. She almost smiled. You are terrible at grand gestures. I am aware. A long, charged silence. His hands were still framing her face and she had not moved away from them. I love you, she said. Quietly, directly, without drama. I did not plan to. I am quite annoyed about it, actually. But there it is. Something broke open in his expression. Not spectacularly. Quietly, the way ice breaks in early March. With a deep, fundamental shift. I love you, he said. I have loved you since a violin sonata 2 years ago, and I have been an absolute coward about it ever since. She laughed, startled, genuine. And he smiled, and the smile reached his eyes and stayed there, and it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in this castle full of beautiful things. When he kissed her, it was careful at first, then not careful at all. And the library, with its 3 stories of books and its glass ceiling, held them in the quiet February light, and neither of them was thinking about reputations or dissolving marriages or London newspaper columns. But happiness, in Vivienne's experience, was never permitted to arrive without someone trying to take it from her. The threat came in the form of a document, a challenge to the dissolution decree, filed through an obscure legal mechanism by Percival Ashbourne's family solicitor, not Percival himself, who was predictably absent from his own legal affairs. His mother, the Dowager Lady Ashbourne, a woman of remarkable spite and legal tenacity, had never forgiven Vivienne for failing to produce an heir and saw the dissolution as a personal insult. The challenge, if pursued, would drag the dissolution into contested proceedings. It would require Vivienne to appear in London. It would make the details of her marriage, the physician's diagnosis, the gambling, the manner of her transfer to Blackmir, public record. Sebastian's solicitor arrived from London within 48 hours of the filing, full of careful language about possible outcomes and suggested strategies. Sebastian heard him out, thanked him, and showed him the door. Then he came to find Vivienne. She was in the kitchen garden, where she always went when she needed to think, standing with both hands pressed flat on the cold stone wall and her eyes on the middle distance. "Tell me what you want to do," Sebastian said, coming to stand beside her. "What are my options?" "Fight the challenge on procedural grounds. My solicitor believes we can have it dismissed, but it will take time and there will be press attention. Or," he paused, or we give them nothing to challenge," he said quietly. "If you would consent to marry me, immediately, by special license, the contested dissolution becomes legally irrelevant. You would be the Duchess of Blackmere. No challenge survives that." Vivienne looked at him. "You are proposing to me in a kitchen garden in February to defeat a legal filing." "I am proposing to you in a kitchen garden in February," he said, "because I want to. The legal utility is a coincidence I find convenient." She studied his face, the steady, certain look in his storm-gray eyes, the complete absence of performance or strategy. "You are going to have to do better than that," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then, with the deliberate precision of a man who has thought about this and is choosing to do it anyway, he went down on one knee in the frost-hardened kitchen garden. "Vivienne," he said, "I was handed something fragile and rare when you walked through my door. I spent the first week trying to convince myself it was an obligation. I spent the second week trying to convince myself it was admiration. By the third week, I had stopped lying to myself with any success. He held her gaze. "I would like to spend the rest of my life in your company, reading in the same room, walking in the same cold, arguing about the same books, being a better person than I would be alone, because you make that seem not only possible but necessary." He paused. "Will you marry me? Please." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. At the Duke of Blackmere kneeling in a kitchen garden, asking with genuine uncertainty in his eyes. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes. Get up, you'll ruin your trousers." He laughed, freely, completely, and stood, and pulled her into his arms, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and felt the solid warmth of him, and the steady beat beneath his coat, and thought, "This is the thing then. This is the real thing, finally." They were married on a Thursday in the Blackmir chapel, in the presence of Mrs. Dray, the steward, 4 members of the household who had been there longest, and Lady Meredith Vane, who had received a brief note from her nephew, and had arrived by the following morning with a new hat and a complete absence of questions. The ceremony took 20 minutes. Vivienne wore deep blue, not white, which was not her color and not her sentiment, and she carried no flowers because the kitchen garden was bare, and she refused to have hothouse arrangements that smelled like someone else's wedding. Sebastian wore his good coat, and forgot to button the second button from the top, and she fixed it for him in the vestibule before they walked in, and the look he gave her when she did, quiet and certain and unmistakably warm, was worth everything that had come before it. They spoke their vows without faltering. Sebastian's voice was steady and low, and he held her eyes throughout, and when it was done and the vicar said man and wife, the small assembled household burst into undignified applause, which Mrs. Dray tried briefly to suppress, and then abandoned. The London papers had their column inches. The Ashbourne family solicitor received a brief letter from Sebastian's legal team that Vivienne was never shown, but which, based on the subsequent silence from that quarter, had said everything necessary. Lord Caldwell wrote a stiff congratulatory note. Sebastian replied with warmth and minimal detail. Lady Meredith stayed for 2 weeks, and spent most of it in the library with Vivienne arguing cheerfully about history, which was the best version of approval either of them knew how to give. And the moor outside turned from frost to pale spring green, and the morning walks continued, and the library evenings continued, and the coffee appeared at precisely 9, and somewhere in the slow, unglamorous miracle of 2 people choosing each other every ordinary day, the Duke of Blackmere became Sebastian, and the disgraced former Lady Ashbourne became Vivienne, Duchess of Blackmere, which was a title, and titles were fine, but what mattered was the name that came before it, and the man who said it, and the way the castle sounded when it held 2 people instead of 1. By the time the summer wildflowers appeared on the moor, the same wildflowers that had been in her room the day she arrived, she realized one morning, and the recognition of that small intentional kindness made her have to stand still for a moment. Vivienne knew she was with child. She told Sebastian on the ridge above the valley, on a warm July evening when the light was long and gold, and the heather had started to turn. He was quiet for so long that she began to formulate a reassurance. Then she saw his face. He looked like a man who had been handed back something he had stopped believing he would ever hold. He took her hands. He said nothing for a while, and then, "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. "Good." His hands tightened on hers. "Good." They stood on the ridge in the summer light for a long time, and did not say much more, because some things do not need dressing in words. She had been traded away for being barren, discarded by a man who needed a reason and found the most convenient one. She had arrived at Blackmir in an ivory gown that should have been a beginning and had instead been a transaction. And she had stood in that entrance hall with her chin up and her eyes dry and nothing but her own steadiness between herself and the worst of it. And the most feared duke in England had looked at her once, one slow, deliberate sweep, and something had awakened in him that he had been trying, for 7 years, to keep safely asleep. In the end, what happened between them was not a fairy tale. It was something more durable than that. 2 people who had been badly used by the world and had, against reasonable expectation, found each other across a card table and a series of library evenings in a kitchen garden in February, and had chosen, every day since, to be careful with what they had found. That was the story. Not grand, not dramatic, simply, completely, irreversibly real. And in the warmth of a Yorkshire summer, with Sebastian's hands in hers on a ridge above the valley, Vivienne Vane, Duchess of Blackmere, thought that real was, after all, the finest thing she had ever been given. Thank you for watching Duke Royal Tales, besties. If this story moved you, please like, comment, subscribe, and share it with someone who deserves a love story today. Another tale is waiting for you at the end of this video. Click and let your heart be swept away once more.